When Sri Lanka gained independence from the British Empire in 1948, it was considered to be one of the most promising new nations with a good economic growth rate thanks to its export-based economy. Relative to other Asian nations, the Sri Lankan community was highly educated with a good literacy rate and a healthy standard of living. But with time, a few top families in the country started to impose their authority over each sector of the country. Sri Lankans were given fake promises over the decades, and these top families arranged everything in a way so that their political power was only transferred between them. Bandaranaike, Rajapaksa, Jayawardena, Wickramasinghe, and Premadasa are some of the families who have controlled the nation for a long time. In front of ordinary people, they act like political enemies toward each other and create unnecessary political unrest among citizens to keep people motivated around their political parties. But in top-level politics, all these parties are handled by several families, and the interesting thing is that they're all relatives going back several generations. Even though there are hundreds of political parties active within this nation, only two major parties and their subgroups are successful in acquiring political power in parliament or presidential elections. People were given attractive offers like government jobs, subsidies, and priority in the state services to attract people towards their political parties. The majority of people voted for them even without a proper understanding of their visions or policies. As a practice, every party that came to power directly influenced the state media, as well as the private media, to hide the truth. Up until the moment of economic collapse, they projected an alternate image in front of Sri Lankans with the help of mainstream media. This economic crisis is the result of poor economic foresight of selfish political leaders who ruled the country for several decades after independence. They had a bad practice of getting loans beyond their capacity to repay to fulfill their day-to-day needs. These bad practices were further aggravated by the 3-decade civil war, which resulted in a substantial annual security budget. Even though the literacy rate is at a considerably high rate, Sri Lankans had no general idea what their government was doing for decades. Every regime took loans to develop infrastructure like roads and buildings, which were not economically profitable revenue-generating investments. None of the parties wanted to support the development of industries or agriculture, pushing the whole nation toward heavy dependency on foreign supplies. During the Rajapaksa era of the country, the amount of loans skyrocketed thanks to the misguidance given by China with tons of unprofitable projects. This economic collapse was not something that happened suddenly, and its external instability was around from late 2014. Foreign debt rose from 30% of the gross domestic product to 41.3% during the period from 2014 to 2019. Also, the total debt rose from 76% to 86% within that period. Meanwhile, sovereign bonds also expanded. People got fed up with the existing government and its poor economic policies. Then, in the next presidential election, people decided to vote for the brother of former President Mahinda Rajapaksa, who lost power in 2015 due to corruption. After coming to power, Gotabaya Rajapaksa cut taxes by considerable amounts, reducing state revenues to make people happy about their regime and to rebuild the faith that his brother had lost in the 2015 election. Then, the corona pandemic hit the island nation, despite its natural sea borders. This was also due to the poor management of the political regime. Then the government had no option but to go into full lockdown. Major foreign revenues like the tourist industry and textile industry were hit hard by the economic crisis, and the government ran out of foreign revenues to fulfill their needs through imports. This is the point when ordinary people really felt the economic collapse. The government acted like there was nothing to worry about. To make people happy during the pandemic, they just printed 5,000 Sri Lankan rupee notes without considering the negative effect of it and distributed them among people who showed them political support. Over several months, the government tried to keep the dollar exchange rates at a considerably low rate, and with the loss of their foreign revenues, they were unable to resist the rising dollar and finally allowed the free floating of the rupee. Then it sharply plummeted to a value of around 370 Sri Lankan rupees per US dollar, resulting in a price hike for all products. At the same time, the government did not have sufficient funds to import coal, crude oil, or natural gas to meet the demands of the energy market. Long queues were created around the oil sheds and gas shops to buy the limited oil stocks received. Hydroelectric power production was not sufficient to fulfill the nation's electricity demands, and they depend heavily on coal and diesel power plants. Their operations halted due to the inadequate supply of coal and diesel, mandating power cuts for several months, pushing the nation into a full-scale energy crisis. Imported food items like rice, wheat, sugar, milk powder, grains, meat, and eggs were not available in sufficient quantities to meet demand and prices. Most people are still only living with one meal a day, as they don't have the income to afford their daily expenses. Most of the factories, shops, and industries were closed with a lower level of income during the corona pandemic. Unemployment rates also increased considerably, causing further damage to the economy. With the developing situation, the Sri Lankan government asked for help from foreign nations for further loans, but no other countries want to give them loans knowing that Sri Lanka has no capability to pay it back. However, India gave some aid to its neighboring state by providing them with a credit line to buy essential items from India. For the first time in its history, in May 2022, Sri Lanka reached a level where it could not pay the interest payment on its foreign debts. At that time, total foreign debt was recorded at $54 billion. All the financial indexes downgraded them to the lowest level, considering them an officially default nation. A huge protest broke out within the nation against the developing economic problem, with Gotabaya Rajapaksa handing over power to Ranil Wickremesinghe, with the aim of preserving their political power instead of giving it to an alternate. He was successful in controlling the protest using his executive power. Wickremesinghe's regime also had no option but to ask for help from the International Monetary Fund, and the IMF was ready to give their help under very strict terms and regulations. Sri Lanka was helpless, and they announced their willingness to accept the aid of the IMF immediately. The first part of the process was debt restructuring, and that required the approval of all nations and institutions that provided loans to Sri Lanka. Except China, all other nations were happy to help them in the debt restructuring process. Before this economic collapse, China acted as the closest friend of Sri Lanka for the past 2 or 3 decades, pumping them with heavy loans for infrastructure development projects, so its response was completely unacceptable in such a difficult situation. After several months, the Chinese government announced their support for the debt restructuring process. Now the IMF is ready to provide $3 billion to support Sri Lanka's economic policies and reforms. The IMF is going to provide this $3 billion in several installments, and the economy will be under the close supervision of the IMF. Now, Ranil Wickremesinghe's government is ready to privatize several unprofitable state-owned companies and institutions with the aim of increasing state revenues rapidly. But this regime is also composed of the remnants of the Rajapaksa regime, and it has no proper plan to move the country out of this dangerous situation and increase state revenues. Both major parties are likely to face heavy defeats in the next municipal election, as people have shown their interest towards alternatives, and they are doing everything they can to attract voters. In reality, all these political parties want is to hold on to their power, and none of them really want to drive Sri Lanka out of this bad economic situation. Even after gaining the support of the IMF, it's impossible to think that Sri Lanka will be able to move out of this economic crisis with the current political regime headed by Rajapaksa and Wickremesinghe. What do you think about the present Sri Lankan economic crisis? Do you see any proper solution for this South Asian nation to move out of danger? Share your thoughts in the comments section below.